Buenas and half a day, everyone, and welcome to the February GA, the General Assembly for Independent Guahan. So today we're going to be talking about pollinating our future. And so I am one of your MCs for tonight. I'm Francine Napati, one of the co-chairs of the Educational Development and Research Committee within Independent Guahan. And now I'd like to introduce one of my other co-chairs, Dr. Tiara Napati, I'm sorry. First, thank you all for being here with us tonight, but I forgot we'd like to open up the space with the Inifresi first. So Inifresi, gineni mastakilo, gihina soko, I mastakalum gi corazonhu, dani masfigo nani nasinyahu, hu frestin maisazo, parabai hu protehi, dan hu defendi, ihinengi, I cultura, I linguahi, I airi, I hanum, zanitano tamoro. Ni idin shoko diretu ginenazuz tata. Esi hu afitma, gihilu I biblia, zani bandirahu, I banderan guahan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know it's been a busy week for all of you, so we always appreciate anytime you guys take time out of your busy schedules to join Independent Guahan. And so now I'd like to introduce one of my co-hosts, Dr. Tiara Napati, to tell you all about the agenda for tonight.
Right, thank you. Buenas and half a day. Thank you, Francine. We have a really exciting topic tonight on pollinating our future. So we've got the Inifresi behind us now, and just a brief opening remarks. I do want to share, we have some updates from Independent Guahan that I'll share tonight before we get into honoring our sign-in, David D.L Flores, excuse me. And for our topic for this evening, we are talking more about pollinating our future. I put a breakout session here. That's actually just our typical Q&A. So stay tuned. If you have questions, you can be posting them to our page so that we can engage and interact with each other a little bit more on this topic. And if you're forward thinking, already excited about the month of March coming up and Chamorro Heritage and History, you should be thinking about our next GA. We have exciting topic that will be announced soon, but for now we put it on here just as a reminder of what's coming ahead at the end of next month. So I'll go ahead and give some information to us about Independent Guahan, just because it's important for us to understand that even though we are of course grateful and so appreciative of everyone joining us in our online formats, even though we continue to not be able to gather in person, we are still organizing these general assemblies and are really grateful that everyone can join us, whether online now or to be watching it later. Our general assemblies, just to provide some background before I get back into the organization itself, we continue to organize these about the possibilities of independence for our island. And so we hope that you will carry on these conversations with your families, with your friends, with other folks in your networks, so that they can help us collectively think together and address the variety of ways that our island will flourish through independence. The beauty of it all is that through independence, it's something that's up to us, right? We get to decide. So as the screen shows here, Independent Guahan as an organization empowers the Chamorro people to reclaim our sovereignty as a nation, inspired by the strength of our ancestors and with the love for future generations. We educate and unify all who call our island home to build a sustainable and prosperous independent future. And so we really encourage you to check out our website, independentguahan.org. Of course, if you are on this, you're probably following us on social media, but you can certainly like and subscribe to all of our updates as we continue to educate the community about the possibility for Guahan. Please contact us if you have any questions. Okay, so for every General Assembly, we do tend to honor a Maga'taotao, who is someone in our community that we are fortunate to learn from and with, and someone that has inspired or has taught us over the years. This title of Maga'taotao is actually one that was created by Sina Ed Beneventi and is used to acknowledge someone that uplifts us, especially within our movement. So before we get into our topic for today, I want us to acknowledge that important person. So many of us have been influenced by people every day and in other parts of our lives with their lived examples of independence, how to sustain ourselves, and what we can be thinking about when we think about what independence or collective change for our political status might be, what decolonization might be for our island. So these Maga'taotao, whether living or those that have passed on, are continuing to make a difference in our communities, in our lands, and within our families. So we really feel that David D.L. Flores is one of these Maga'taotao. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miget Lujan Bivakwa. I'll stop my screen share so that he can give us our tribute to our Maga'taotao, David D.L. Flores. You might have seen his quote on our flyer. And that's one of the things that we're so excited to hear a little bit more about him before we get into the material for tonight.
Sidros Masi Tiara, thank you so much to you and Francine. And so talking about David De Leon Flores, it is a little bit difficult for me because he was a younger brother of my grandmother. So he is my uncle David. And so I really wish that sort of some of his children or his grandchildren could be here to share about him and sort of the life that he lived, but I'm happy to fill in and provide some information and some background as best as I can. And so my Uncle David was Familia Cabeza, and Familia Cabeza, if you are in the Cabeza family, then, you know, Cabezas, we have a reputation to protect. Cabezas are man malapte hit, we're pretty smart, man shanarp hit, we're pretty sharp. And so everybody's family is like that, I know. But so I'm having a little bit of family pride here for my own. And so my Uncle David, let's start off with him as a war survivor. In his own words. And so I wanted to share, over the years, he did many interviews, talked about his war experiences. And as I'll talk about in a second, he did a lot to promote the stories of war survivors and help them receive recognition. And so here is a segment of his World War II story. He was 15 years old when World War II broke out. So he was a teenager and a young man. He literally became, literally became an adult during sort of this traumatic period. And so here he is talking about some of his experiences towards the close of the occupation.
Upon arriving at Manyangan, we immediately set up, now this is propaganda. Everybody has been ordered to congregate in Manila for the march to Manyangan. And so upon arriving in Manyangan, we immediately set up our shelter. There was no shelter for the people. People just went about getting materials from the jungle, wood for a frame, coconut leaves for the roof, and wall partition. People became very ingenious at the time of need. After setting up our shelter, we helped others set up theirs. In fact, just about everyone who was available helped others set up their shelter. Right away, the Japanese started conscripting men to do their work. When a person in charge of getting the workers came to our place, he saw me and immediately called me out. This was basically the way it was for us to act, and it worked out really well because personally, I preferred that my father stay with the family and I be taken. For the short period we were at the camp, we were really busy moving all kinds of supplies for the Japanese, indicating that they were on the move to somewhere. They were making sure, however, that no one knew where the destination of the supplies. We'd leave the supplies at a site and leave right away. There was another time when we were assigned to move supplies to the newly designated headquarters of the retreating Japanese forces at Fonti. Nearly all the able-bodied men were conscripted for this move, and my father and my brother were included. This move took us to the bottom of a hill in Fonti, where we carried supplies up to the top of the hill. The soldiers were digging in to defend their tentative position to slow down the advancing U.S. forces. I picked up my load and hurried up the hill, where I saw just outside the reef from Oroti to Two Lovers Point a line of ships of all shapes and sizes. As I gazed at the scene with obvious joy and excitement, I was struck with a rifle butt and told to move on. I ran down the hill to tell my father and my brother what I saw. My dad told me they had seen the ships to But my brother had not gone up yet, and for me to take his place, which I excitedly did, and practically ran up the hill. Upon completion of the Ponte job, we were told to return to Manyengan. But before we could move, the bombardment started, and the group scattered as everyone sought cover. We were separated from the group and found a mango tree where we joined my father's friend, also crouching behind the tree trunk. When the bombardment passed, we immediately left and headed towards Odut and onto Manyengan and away from the line of fire from the bombardments. Well, we didn't quite make it. We got into the line of fire and we were caught in a rain of shrapnel from the exploding shells. And that was scary because we did not have any protection, at least for our heads, not even a piece of wood or even a hat. When the bombardment passed, we were so relieved. We had not gone more than 100 yards. However, when we met with another danger, a group of drunken Japanese soldiers confronted us with sharpened wooden lances. We stopped, and I told my father to stay put with my brother while I tried to reason with them. If they persisted in harming us, I would aggravate them and make them chase me, and when that happened, they could make their get away by taking the jungle trail that my father knew. And I told him not to worry about me because I could easily outrun the soldiers in the jungle. When I came within talking distance, they became more aggressive and threatening with their spears and swords. I told them in my broken Japanese that we had just come from doing work with the Japanese soldiers and we were just returning home. I don't know how much they understood, but the officer in charge, the guy with the sword, turned around and without saying a word, lowered his sword and went back into the station and went home to Manyengan safely.
All right. And can you imagine? I mean, for nowadays, I think the craziest thing that people deal with, of course, is your Netflix account sort of not having enough screens because all of your family uses it. Or and so to imagine what a sort of a young man would have gone through during the war, it's humbling. It's important that we remember the strength of their stories. And for my Uncle David and for his family, they put a lot of time, especially through the Manyengan Memorial Foundation in terms of honoring war survivors, doing their part to try to build memorials such as the one that is down in Manyengan Valley, sort of to honor them and recognize them. My Uncle David was recognized as one of the Liberation Day Grand Marshals for the parade in 2019. And so one of the things that a lot of war survivors remembered from that time, of course, is that people in trying times, difficult times, found ways to pull together and work together, even when things were good, even when things were bad. And that was some of the wisdom that he hoped that people take from that time, is that the strength, the strength that our ancestors possessed wasn't sort of always like a physical outward strength. A lot of it was an ability to work together, to collaborate, to share resources, to share the load and the burden. And so my Uncle David is here in this picture. This is the Bank of Guam staff in 1947. He is right over here on the left side. And so my Uncle David was part of the new generation, born under the US Navy prior to World War II, but they would inherit an island in which there was more freedom than previous years. The Organic Act was passed in 1950. People who had been born US nationals with no rights suddenly had some rights as US citizens. The government Guam was created, and there was still lots of restrictions, still lots of federal oversight, but there was this feeling of openness that they were getting a chance to build the island, rebuild it after the war, but then build it up in new ways that their parents and grandparents hadn't been able to. And so my Uncle David was part of that generation who was working to build up the government of Guam once it became a civilian thing and it wasn't under the control of the US military anymore. He was a pioneer in terms of Guam's development, working at the Department of Agriculture in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s as the head for the Guam Economic Development Authority, GIDA. He worked sort of creating some of the infrastructure that we take for granted today. In the 60s, of course, they were working hard to try to modernize farming. One of the things that he helped out with was making connections between local farmers to sell their produce in the military commissaries. He was also there in terms of helping getting the tourism started, in terms of helping get hotels onto the island that tourists could visit. And so he was around for a lot of those things which we take for granted today. Him and his generation built up the Guam that we have now. Now we can agree and disagree with some of the choices that they made, but ultimately, as his contemporary, Sus Leon Guerrero, who started the private company, the Bank of Guam, as he always liked to remind me, you know, it wasn't America who built up the island after the war. They helped get it started, but it was really Chamorros. It was our people with the help of some allies, some other ethnic groups, some Filipinos, some people from the States, a few from Micronesia, but it was really us who actually built up this island, you know, and we shouldn't give Uncle Sam all the credit when it was us who were really doing the work. And so there are not many people from that generation left who helped build up the island after the war. And so when Uncle David passed away last year, it was sort of another part of that pioneering generation gone, unfortunately. My Uncle David lived a very political life with the Popular Party and then later the Democratic Party, running for political office. In 1974, he ran as the lieutenant governor alongside Manny Guerrero, who used to have a building named after him. It was destroyed though, and now there's a garden there in Hagåtña, in the Plaza de España. But so Manny Guerrero was one of the first Chamorros to be appointed governor. He tried to run for governor again in the 70s. He ran with my Uncle David. They unfortunately did not win. But politics was a huge part of my Uncle David's life. And so one of the parts of Guam history, which is unfortunately for many people today has largely been forgotten, was the first Constitutional Convention. Now, the current delegate for Guam, Mike San Nicolas, he has mentioned sort of that we might want to start a new Constitutional Convention, that we might want to have a go at drafting a constitution. In truth, Guam has had two constitutional conventions. The second Constitutional Convention, it created a draft constitution that was overwhelmingly defeated by the voters. If you watched Fanatsu this week, we talked to Hope Cristobal and Rosa Salas Palomo, who were part of the campaign to defeat that constitution in 1979. But the first Constitutional Convention is one that is largely forgotten by many people because it was an ambiguous venture. It was part of an effort to try to figure out what Guam is. What is its power? What is its authority? What is it? Since the 1920s, Chamorros had been asking Uncle Sam, what are we to you? In the words of Ramon Sablan, who wrote Fanogi Chamorro, the Guam hymn, are we fish or are we fowl? Are we a part of America? Are we not a part of America? What are we? The Organic Act was passed, which made Chamorros and others on Guam US citizens, but Guam was still a territory of the United States. You didn't get to participate in the democracy of the US. The US Congress passed laws that you had no control over. What was Guam? And it's important to remember that in the 60s, the governor on the island was still appointed by the president. And for people like my Uncle David, they grew frustrated at that time because as they were trying to start businesses and industries on the island, what they found is that the federal government would move in to shut them down on behalf of US economic interests, because they didn't want companies in Guam competing with American companies. And so the Constitutional Convention, that first one, was the brainchild of my Uncle David's first cousin, Dick Taitano, Senator Dick Taitano, also Cabeza, but also Cueto. And so he pushed for a constitutional convention so that Guam could try to figure out what are we, what are our next steps. And part of that, part of the sort of the drama of that convention is, does Guam have the ability to even have its own constitutional convention? As a territory of the United States, could Guam draft a constitution? Guam was told that they were self-governing, that the United States said, you have the ability to self-govern, you can elect some of your leaders, you can pass some laws for yourself, you're not a colony, you're self-governing. And the Constitutional Convention wanted to understand that more and to even challenge that. Is that true? Because while the Constitutional Convention was happening on Guam, other places around the world were decolonizing. The islands around us in the Trust Territory were sitting and negotiating with the United States about what they wanted for their political future. None of that was happening for Guam. And so this Constitutional Convention happened, and it cost at that time about $150,000, and it didn't create a constitution. The convention realized that legally they could not make one because as a territory, Guam has, according to the federal government, no inherent rights except what Congress allows it. So according to the US, we don't have the ability to pass a constitution unless the US allows us to. And even then, it's not really a constitution. It's an extension of federal power over Guam. The Constitutional Convention was disconcerting. And my Uncle David, as you can see here in the back here, he was the executive director, helping oversee the Constitutional Convention, and many people who have buildings named after them, such as Tony Palomo, who I work in a building which is named for him, the Guam Museum. He was there, he was the president of the convention. Frank Lujan over here, Adrian Sanchez, who were both senators, Joe Ada, who was senator then, later became governor. A lot of the important political figures at that time all sat, heard testimony, talked to each other, brainstormed, but they ultimately realized that they couldn't create a constitution. And so they instead drafted a list of recommendations for the US Congress about changes to the Organic Act that would improve Guam's position. Congress and the federal government ignored 23, I think, out of 24 of them, only passing one of those changes, which was to create a non-voting delegate position for Guam. And so this was an eye-opening experience for the participants in the Constitutional Convention, because for many of them who had lived with no rights under the US Navy prior to the war, survived Japanese occupation, they felt that now that they're US citizens, now that there's the Organic Act, everything's going to be better. In the words of Carlos Taitano, who was also part of that generation, once you're a part of the American family, once you have citizenship, then they have to listen to you. They have to treat you with respect. But what these leaders found is that not necessarily true, is that the voices of the people in Guam still didn't really matter just because they were US citizens. They were far away. They were brown. They were largely brown voices, which matter less than white voices. Sadly, a little bit even up until today, right? And so it was hard to be respected. It was hard to be treated fairly when you still didn't matter as much. Your island was very important to the Pentagon, but the will and the interests, the dreams, the desires of the people mattered to almost nobody in the United States. And so the Constitutional Convention, the failure of it, was an important moment in opening the minds of the political leaders to where what F.B. Leon Guerrero, who was known as the father of the Organic Act, what he referred to as where angels had feared to tread before, which refers to political status change for Guam. That in his generation, they had been fearful of talking about things like independence or statehood or changing Guam's status because their relationship to America was, F.B. Leon Guerrero famously, he spoke out against Navy governors. He got thrown in jail multiple times, just like that, thrown right in jail, no trial, just to punish him because he spoke out against the Navy. For our grandparents and our great-grandparents' generation, that was the US that they knew. It changed when Uncle Sam came back in World War II, but still, they hadn't imagined that we should push for anything more than just citizenship or a little bit more rights within the United States. But the Constitutional Convention that my Uncle David was the executive director for, it opened up the minds where basically it led to the start of the first Political Status Commission, the first ever studies for Guam about what political status options Guam could change to. How could it become a state? Could it become a commonwealth? Could it become freely associated? Could it become independent? And so, what's it called? I definitely thank those leaders at that time for taking that step to kind of push the decolonization conversation ahead, because other generations have taken it and moved with it up until where we are now. And so, you know, my Uncle David, when I knew him when I was young, of course, he was just my Uncle David. I knew him primarily through the SDA church, and you know, and his wife was my Auntie Dudang, best Chamorro name ever, Auntie Dudang. And so my Auntie Justa. And so I knew them, of course, as my grandma's relatives, you know, important close family members, important people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Guam. And even up until when I was a grad student, I never really talked to him a lot about political status issues, decolonization issues. In fact, the first time that I interviewed him in the early 2000s, I went with my grandmother and we just sat and we talked about the family history, his war stories. And I didn't even know at that time that he had been part of the Constitutional Convention. I was just starting to learn about it. But years later, though, after I had become somebody who was known for decolonization, for independence, for political status issues, a historian, then I found that sometimes I would see my Uncle David and my aunties, especially his daughters, Auntie Liz, Auntie Edna, Auntie Evelyn, Auntie Linda, who has also passed away sadly, would see them and sort of, you know, and he would engage with me in conversations. You know, in fact, one of the sort of village meetings that we had through the Commission on Decolonization a few years ago, my Uncle David was there, my aunties were there, and they had questions, they wanted to know more. And it was the first time that I spoke to him directly about these sorts of issues. And then ever since that time, every time I would see him, and interestingly enough, I would usually see him in the middle of the night at the MTM McDonald's, because his family lived in Toktu, and so him and his Manamku crew, probably unable to sleep because of their meds, they would hang out at sort of McDonald's in the middle of the night. We usually think about Chamorros hanging out at McDonald's early in the morning to get that coffee. There's also the night crew. There's also the Tatalopoengi crew. And so I remember once when I was sitting with him and he had a few of his friends there and we were talking, and I asked him, I wanted to know about the Constitutional Convention because we had never spoken much about it. And, you know, he shared some of his experiences. And one of the things that he said that always stuck with me is, how can you be self-governing if you don't control your borders, can't control your economy, and can't write your own constitution? And that's where we are right now. Can you really say that you govern yourself if some of these basic things in life you cannot control? You don't have a say over what happens with them. And so my Uncle David passed away last year after a long battle with cancer. And so I'm glad that a few months before he passed, I ran into him and my Auntie Edna at GPO, and I got to sit down with him for a little while. But I definitely miss the voices of our elders who want to share with us the wisdom of their experiences, their successes and their failures, their frustrations, and then most importantly, their dreams for what we can do next in the future. And so I've been grateful at the chance to talk about my Uncle David, and Sidusmasi to Independent Wahon for honoring him as Maga'taotao.
That was such a powerful tribute, and I think that's just so important to help us remember the folks that have, as we said, come before us. And I really think I learned a lot, especially to think about, from local farm work to politics at that time, and the way that those things can really relate to even our topic for tonight, to think about the future, but also to think about the past and what are we pollinating in a sense in that way. So I think that's a great segue for us as we continue to think about these complexities, but also these stories, right? So I'm just using this chance to segue into our panelists for this evening. We have another honored guest in our midst. And I have this photo here that I find really exciting because it demonstrates some of the work of our panelist, who is tonight here with us, Mr. Christopher Rosario, who's the president of the Guam Beekeepers Association. And Mr. Rosario, or Chris, as you might know him otherwise, has done a lot of local collaborating and really just used a lot of the skills and education and gifts that he has to help our community understand everything from workshops to helping people who might want to become new beekeepers in their backyards, to other folks who might want to become new members of the Beekeepers Association. He works with the Department of Agriculture. For several years, he's been working with the University of Guam. He has a master's degree, so he's very educated. And if I can add to the mix, he's quite skilled with the bee jokes and the bee related puns. So I'm hoping that that's also in store for us this evening. Tonight, we'll be learning a little bit more about our topic from him. He's also someone who cares deeply about Guahan and its future. And so half a day and welcome to you, Chris. I'm gonna stop my screen share. I know I did wanna share this one last photo that was you in action here behind some bees at the recent Migratory Birds of Guahan Fair that took place earlier this month in February. So it's possible that some of you have seen him around, seen him generating a lot of buzz, as you will. And because he cares so much about our future and our thinking about it, we're just so excited to have you sharing more of your knowledge and experience with us tonight. So we'll turn it over to you.
Cool, thank you. Half a day, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me just go ahead and get this slideshow started. Okay, so just want to make sure though that you guys are seeing just the full presentation and without my notes. Yeah, so thank you for the kind introduction, Tiara. I know before I go further in depth into the presentation, I do also want to state that, you know, I really want to take all my hats off, you know, from the Guam Beekeepers Association, Department of Agriculture. I really want to be able to represent myself as a regular citizen of Guam, because for one, when I first started getting into this industry, it really I actually again started, you know, again, just when I got into this industry, I just graduated the year before receiving my bachelor's degree in biology, and my hopes and dreams were to actually get into vet school, but and then when, you know, I get a call from my mentor, Dr. Ross Miller, who's currently the entomologist, called me up and asked if I was interested in doing research in honeybees. So although I got into beekeeping not just as a hobby per se, but more so as a scientist, and so I kind of came into this blindfolded. But throughout this presentation, kind of again, as a citizen, I want to be able to show how things have unfolded and see how the beekeeping activities on Guam became the way they are today. And so by that, I'll start presenting the pollinators of Guam and a growing apiculture. So let's kind of keep this question in mind while I go through the presentation: is where would we be without pollinators? And really, I want this question to kind of stick with you throughout the presentation, because it's going to begin. We're going to begin to understand. Well, really, can we really, as a society, work independently off of pollinators? But before we understand, talk about how important pollinators are, well, we got to talk about, well, what is pollination? And so, and then of course, why bother? What's so important about pollination? And of course, lastly, so we want to identify who are the pollinators for Guam. So let's start with the fundamentals of some plant biology, and it might be a little too much, but again, pollination starts from when a bee, or whether it's the wind or some other insect, gets pollen, and is basically the flower gets basically it's the transfer of pollen from what we call, I'm not sure if you see my, I don't know if you see my can you see my cursor? Okay, because it'll probably help to see the cursor. So the male part of the plant is called the stamen, and that's what kind of holds all that pollen. And so the bee obviously would go for pollen, right? So pollen is it's a main source, it's a main diet for honeybees. And so what the bee does, the forager goes onto the male part of the plant, and then, for instance, it goes onto another part of the plant because it didn't get enough pollen. And so as it flies to another plant, the pollen essentially gets transferred to the pistil, which basically is the female part of the plant. And so that pollen will essentially go from the anther, which is essentially number one right here, which is holds all the pollen. And then when the bee goes on to another plant, sometimes that pollen falls off the leg, or again, the pollen particles fall to the pistil, which is the female part of the plant. And then from the pistil, the top of the pistil, it goes down this style. So we call it the style of the plant. Oops. Oh, shoot. And then from there, you basically get fertilization of the plant. And then, of course, what happens after with fertilization, you basically create either a seed or in some cases a fruit. And so that's kind of how pollination takes place. Now, sometimes pollination, which I guess I'll talk about it more in the next couple of slides. But the importance of pollination, for one, is we have to thank our pollinators, because for 1 in 3 mouths of food and drinks, everything from coffee to chocolate to most fruits, vegetables in our diet comes from pollinators. And the pollination is crucial for kind of many of the animal products that we consume, so including the dairy products. So beef, pork, and poultry, they actually rely on pollinators. So like some of these, some like pork and beef, we would feed them like legumes, right? Or alfalfa or clover at some point of time during their growth. So they get big and bulky, and then now we have a meat industry. So when we start to think about what we ate yesterday for breakfast or lunch or dinner, you really look at your food, look at the food plate. Again, we're some of us are meat eaters, some of us are plant eaters, and of course we can already see the importance of pollinators in our diet. And so the ecosystem that they provide enables plants to kind of produce the fruits and seeds. And so 35% of the agricultural land is the support of production of really 87 of the leading food crops worldwide. So such as like apples. One of the big ones is almonds, almonds in California. And so you think about worldwide, 24, well, actually not just worldwide, but in the US alone, it's $24 billion. And so now we kind of talked about, okay, the kind of the importance of pollination. Let's look at this next question. Well, who are the pollinators for Guam? Because we just look at Guam alone, we begin to realize, well, what is Guam without honeybees, right? Say, for instance, and quite frankly, we look at several things here. So the pollination on Guam is not just driven by honeybees or are not driven by other insects, but it's also other drivers such as wind and water. Wind and water are like one of the, again, it's called what we call an abiotic factor of pollination. And if you can give me any and then of course for the biotic factors, right? If you can give me any insect that's native that does pollination, it's quite rare to see that, especially today on Guam, because today on Guam, the whole ecosystem has changed from, I mean, again, we talked about, Mr. Pravaka talked about the war. And so obviously with all of those changes on the landscape and the ecosystem in general, has kind of affected really where, where our native pollinators are at today, and or even if they even still exist. And so pollination on Guam is I mean, it's still in the works. We're still trying to figure out who are really the pollinators. And so several things here. So we have some accidental and intentional pollinators. And so of course, honeybees are not native to Guam. And a lot of people think, well, maybe the Spanish brought them in during, pre-war times. And so, and to be quite frank, no, there's no, as far as I know right now, there is no data stating that bees have existed way before, in the 1900s. So in 1907 was when they actually first came to Guam. Oh no. Oh, okay, yeah. So kind of looking at all the articles, I think after several years of doing honeybee research, I tried to figure out, well, how did bees end up getting here in the first place? And so I look at so many types of research articles. I mean, back in the early 50s, 1913, I have a couple of ones, recent ones, 1994. But you begin to realize, I mean, 1950, you begin to realize that there's really not much work done in terms of research, but in terms of what was being discovered here, a lot of that work was being done after World War II. So, and after World War II, a lot of stuff happened on Guam. And so there's really a huge change. So even with going as early as I could, there's not much data that we could really obtain before the early before the early 1900s. And so one of the recent ones in 2014, there was a Pacific habitat for planting for pollinators. It kind of identified who were the pollinators, not just on Guam, but in the Pacific Islands area. But what we found that with many of the studies, that the potential native pollinators during the early 1900s, before the brown tree snake came in, before the war, were the birds and the bats. Now we know birds as not necessarily as pollinators per se. We know them more as seed dispersers. And so that's kind of after the pollination occurs. So seed, again, but some of the birds, I can definitely say that like the Micronesian honey eater. If you look at the beak of this bird, it tells you kind of a lot about what it actually does feed on. So if it feeds on certain fruits or of course, if that beak is long enough, then that's long enough to kind of stick its beak into a flower. And so as it sticks its beak into the flower, then it actually obtains pollen sometimes at the base of its beak. And so there's some inference of some birds feeding on nectar, obtaining pollen, and transferring that pollen from one plant to the other. And of course, the fruit bat. The fruit bat is one of the major pollinators. Not just on Guam, but on several endemic species of fruit bat around the world have been known to be good pollinators. And so I would label the Mariana fruit bat, despite the research that hasn't really been done here on Guam pre-war time, we can definitely say, yeah, the fruit bat is hairy. It's obviously when it goes onto a fruit or when it goes to a tree to obtain nectar, because or feeding on fruit, it would obtain pollen on itself and then transfer from there. And so I wanted to state here a comment that the loss of birds' role as pollinators appears to be a weaker driver of ecosystem change following the bird loss on Guam. So it just talks about that we're basically under the EBL project, which basically they've done some of the research in terms of whether the loss of the birds and the loss of the bats had a crucial role in the pollination on Guam. And quite frankly, some of the native pollinators still kind of survived without the presence of birds and the presence of bats. And that kind of tells us a little bit more, well, it maybe Guam wasn't just driven by insect pollination or other types of pollination, but mainly driven by wind pollination. And when you kind of think about, okay, the pollination on Guam without the insects, let's kind of talk about without the insects first. You think about, okay, so what time of the year, right, do we see a pickup on wind, right? So the trade winds, when do the trade winds come in? And so during certain times of the year, the trade winds will come in, and some of the flowers and the plants and the trees will respond to the wind. And so they start to flower during the trade wind season. And so that tells you a little bit, okay, well, I guess Guam was more so wind pollinated as opposed to insect pollinated. Now, the insects are kind of, I would say, are kind of a secondary pollinator. And then we'll see in some cases here. But the insect pollinators on Guam, so looking at some of the families of insects, I'm not going to go deep into that, but there are several native, okay, I wouldn't say several, but there is one individual native bee that is actually potentially found to be a pollinator, and it's called a sweat bee, and that's in the family Halictidae. Now, we do have a native sweat bee, not just here on Guam, but all throughout the Marianas Islands. And it's good to know that because, well, we can say that, yeah, that native bee had body hairs. And again, I'm kind of referencing the top here, talking about how it had a corbiculum. A corbiculum is basically the part of the leg of the bee. It's the hind leg that carries pollen. So knowing that we have a native bee or a native sweat bee that had a structure to carry pollen tells us a lot about, okay, this is actually a native pollinator that we have. But then of course you have other introduced species such as the honeybee, the leafcutter bee, and the yellow-faced bee, which basically weren't, again, they have that same structure, but then they're also present worldwide. And so it kind of tells you, okay, so maybe these bees came in and they were brought in on purpose for pollination. So the next thing is bees. So let's kind of dive a little bit more into the bees, because now we're starting to identify, okay, who are the major pollinators? Okay, not just wind and water anymore, but when we start diving into who are the insect pollinators on Guam, we start to look at the bees. And so this is where my comfort level of presenting to the audience what they bring to us. And so the most important pollinators right now worldwide is basically the bees. I would say bees in general, because they actively collect pollen. And many bees will collect pollen and make a pollen ball, and they would use that pollen for bee bread. It's a nutritional supplement. So for each pollen ball they make, the females will lay one egg on top of it. This is for several species of bees in general. I'm not going to talk about honeybees just yet, but it's a provision that the nourishment of that larva the larva of the bee will eat it until they pupate. So there's 4 insect life cycles. So there's egg, larva, pupa, adult. Within the bee world, some bees will take that pollen, put it inside, whether it's a cell or a cavity, and then they'll lay the eggs on top of the pollen. And so that, again, shows the nutritional supplement. So where am I getting at here? It's just, oops, sorry. Where am I getting at here? I'm just basically stating that any bee that relies on pollen would be considered an efficient pollinator. And so they also exhibit flower constancy. So one bee won't just go from one flower and then decide to go to another flower. It will stick with that same species of that flower until it's gotten back into its hive or its colony. And then when it goes back out, then it decides to go to a different flower. So if we know that, then we know that that pollination is efficient because the bee is sticking to the same species of flowers. And then, of course, not to mention, they regularly forage in an area around the nest. So bees are optimistic foragers, meaning they'll go to the most abundant available plant in the environment. So Aristotle kind of saw this. I mean, it's early, back way before, I don't know when, the 624, I think it's BC, but on each expedition, the bee does not fly from one flower of one kind to another, but flies from one violet, say, to another violet, and never meddles with another flower until it has gotten back to a hive. So Aristotle saw this firsthand and wrote it in his book. So now let's kind of dive into honeybees. So it's an essential non-native pollinator. Now, what makes them non-native? Well, European. So honeybees are actually from Europe. But then in Europe, then I'm talking about, if we talk about kind of go way further before prehistoric times, before pre-human times, honeybees have gone not just from Europe, but have also migrated down to Africa. And I dive a little bit more into that. But the most crop pollination is done by the European honeybee and is, again, most widespread in the world. I think my next couple of slides will show you how the bees have moved across the world. So I'll be backing up all these statements that you see here with the upcoming slides. So many crops are reliant on the single pollinator. And today there are about almost 3 million bee colonies in the United States. Now I'm talking about just the United States alone because, well, as we unfold what's happening right now with the bees worldwide, we're kind of focusing a little bit on the US side because there's a lot of diseases that are coming out globally, but mainly in the US. And of course, Guam being a territory of it, we want to be able to see some of the links that maybe Guam could provide queens either to the US or globally. And so we look at honeybees in agriculture. So I mentioned a variety of crops. And so you're looking at sunflowers, looking at garlic, you're looking at lettuce, blueberries. I mean, there's just so much that they do. And of course, honey production is kind of just the icing on this cake. The cake is actually the pollination services that the bees provide. And other products that the bees provide are like honey, obviously the creamed honey, and wax, obviously pollen. But if you note, pay attention right here. In 2018, the U.S. produces 152 million pounds of honey, but then we actually consume 500, I mean, 3 times the amount. So what does that tell you? That basically tells you that most of the honey that's being sold in the stores in the US and even on Guam today, most of that honey is being imported into the US. And so I could dive a little bit more into it, but let's kind of move further along. So honeybees create that market for local produce and products. That's what I really want to get down into. And so if we look at the work of honeybees on again, single honeybees, like I mentioned, it came in from 1907, and this was dating. So this statement kind of dates way back to 1913. This was one of the first agricultural reports was that was being recorded for Guam. And so it states that, as mentioned from the report, in June 30th, 1912, all honeybees on the island of Guam have descended from a single queen bee. You believe that? A single queen bee introduced by the naval government from Honolulu in the year 1907. And so that queen bee, and then ended up this happening. We have what, over 100,000 of colonies here on Guam. I probably would believe we have about 10,000 colonies on the island. It's just, you know, us beekeepers right now, we're only touching the surface of the amount of colonies that we have compared to what the island has. And so Peter Nelson, one of the famous agriculturalists that worked in the field back then was had also stated that the bees came in 1907. And so how did they get here? Well, if we think of honeybees right now, actually at several parts of the world, honeybees are actually considered invasive. Well, why is that? Why are they considered invasive? Well, if you look at several parts of the world, such as maybe Costa Rica or perhaps Mexico, there are native pollinators that are actually competing. So when we think of a pollinator, when we think of an invasive insect, we think of, well, one, competition, right? An invasive insect competes with the native fauna. It competes with humans, right? So in this case, honeybees are competing with the native fauna. Another one is a colonization, right? So the bees have colonized with man. I mean, all over the world. I mean, we basically start from England here. So go from England or from Europe. And of course, within Europe, the bees had traveled down through Africa and had basically all the gray boxes that you see here are what we call subspecies of the honeybee. So you can think of subspecies as like a Rottweiler compared to a German Shepherd. That's a subspecies of dogs per se. So honeybees have actually created, because worldwide, over several hundred years of migrating all around the world, the honeybees have created 22 different subspecies of itself. And it's actually quite fascinating. So they've adapted to the floral resources around the world because of the colonization of man, but because they're also competing with native bees, they are considered invasive. And so, because, again, 1907, we had honeybees, we had several, probably I could only raise maybe a couple of fingers from the time that they were introduced to the time in 2013, when I first started my research. I can only hold up a handful of beekeepers that actually got into beekeeping. And so kind of go through the timeline. So in 2006, that's when the colony collapse disorder was discovered in the US alone, but in worldwide, they're actually already starting to experience this. And then, of course, USDA said, well, we got to do a nationwide survey. And of course, 4 years later, Guam became a part of the survey and a part of that survey. So we said, well, yeah, we have honeybees on Guam, so let's do the survey here. And we found with that survey, and a year later, the discovery of the varroa mite. And so discovery of the varroa mite, of course, it's kind of like, okay, well, let's continue to do this research to see whether how many colonies are affected by this mite, because this mite is what's causing the bees to collapse, not just the mite itself, but a bunch of different factors. The mite is just a huge component of colony collapse disorder. And so in 2015, that's when I formed the Guam Beekeepers Association along with Dr. Miller. So really, it was just a club of beekeepers, and we really just wanted to kind of promote this industry. And then, of course, a year later, we had the greater banded hornet, which is another invasive pest. And then we became, and then 4 years later, Guam Beekeepers finally became an official nonprofit organization. So beekeeping within the last 2 decades have kind of really grown significantly. Well, I mean, in terms of this timeline, not so much, but definitely a lot happening within the past decade. And so when we look at growth, we're looking at, I mean, the exponential growth is just astounding to me. I mean, we, again, started just with a handful of beekeepers in 2013, and I was doing a survey, right? I had to figure out how am I going to get 24 different apiaries, 24 different beekeepers when we only had 5 at the time. And so there was this harmony of people having honeybees in their backyard that they wanted to get rid of, and then you had other people who wanted to get started doing beekeeping. And I saw this again as an individual citizen, a student, not even a student at the time, just as a research associate, saying, well, wow, there's so many feral bee colonies in people's backyards, but then not enough beekeepers to actually start beekeeping. And so I found that, you know, I think this is where we need to start to grow, the industry, because again, there was a harmony. There were people that didn't want bees, and there were people that wanted bees. So I, as an individual citizen, had gone out, extracted these feral colonies, and put them where, basically took bees out where they were unwanted and put them where they were wanted. And so, yeah, as you can see here, some of the photos, some of the apiaries that we have built over time. But now you look at the number of beekeepers in 2013 and compared to 2021, I mean, that's amazing. Just amazing to see that growth. And so, so if we look at the why they thrive so well here on Guam, well, let's look at some of the videos here. So obviously, we farming is a huge component. When we start thinking about, well, bees impact, you know, bees are pollinators for this and that. Well, we just do it based off of observation. But when we look at these videos, it's amazing to see how much they do, how much pollen that they collect. I mean, you have cucumber. I think this is cucumber here, and then you have squash on the first video. Second video again is that's a dragon fruit, if you don't know. And then the last video here is a single forager foraging on the banana plant. So really cool stuff to see firsthand experience. You know, when you're taught in school about how bees pollinate this and that, it's always a good feeling to see, well, yeah, they do pollinate it. Here's the video, you know. So and then, of course, wanted to show another video that was recorded. You can see that the bees on the pollen, or you see the pollen on the bees, and the bees trying to fit in through this mesh where we've protected the bees from the hornet. But you can see all that pollen and the different colors of pollen that they bring back. is what makes it even more amazing. So just looking at their behavior in general, again, so much to cover, and let's just kind of move on with it before I yeah. So this is what the association has kind of looked like. Again, is looking, just taking my hats off as a citizen, looking at the growth of the association really shows that that this is a collaborative effort. It's not just every individual keeper for themselves, and that was, wouldn't say that was part of the problem before, but I would say it definitely impeded the growth. So in order for you to grow, there's got to be some collaboration efforts. But of course, there are some other agendas, right? That people can say, well, I want to, whether there's competition, right? But I think sticking with the collaboration aspect of things really helps push things forward. In almost anything. And so collaboration to me is a key ingredient for growth. And so when we look at Guam's apiculture industry right now, there's the small scale agriculture that we have on Guam, and that small scale agriculture really puts us in a great position of honeybees never having to starve. If you look at big scale agriculture, like huge scale agriculture, you're looking at acres of corn, acres of almonds, acres of apples, and a bee colony is stuck right in the middle of that orchard. What's going to happen as a honeybee, right? You go out and forage, you're only foraging for one thing, and it's just apples. Can you imagine going to the grocery store and only picking up one type of diet for the rest of your life? I mean, the lifespan of a honeybee is only 40 days, 45 days. And so so being in a small scale agriculture gives us, it gives, I wouldn't say gives, but the diet of the honeybee becomes more polyfloral, because the bees aren't just going to go for the weeds or the apples or the bananas. They're going to forage for a multitude of things, which give off multitude of vitamins and different types of fatty acids. And then of course on Guam, we don't have a winter season. So what does that mean? Well, because we don't have a winter season, the bees don't have to stay in the colony and hibernate. And then of course, swarming is all year round. So we're constantly getting just so many, queen bees being produced in a colony, because they get so overcrowded during the time of the year that, hey, our colony is it's basically overgrowing to a point where we gotta branch out. And then of course, part of my research at the University of Guam was looking at the pest load, the disease load in some of these colonies. And quite frankly, we've seen a parasite in it, but the pest load of honeybees on Guam compared to the mainland US is very, very low, significantly low. And of course, we have the floral diversity. So yes, that chain of love that we all kind of hate, well, the bees love it. But the diversity of not just the chain of love, but you got the weeds, you got some of the agricultural crops, you got some of the foxtail palms that are out on the highway, that are supporting our bee population. So some of the research right now, the research and development is supporting farmers through several grants, and it's like for instance, like the Beginner Farmer Ranchers Development Grants. We've gotten people started off with a single colony and collecting data as the honeybee colony grows. There's a lot of outreach and acknowledging local beekeepers. So we have World Bee Day. We have several channels, PBS channels of supporting other local beekeepers, getting the beekeepers product out there. USDA National Honeybee Survey has continued since 2013. And then a Sentinel Apiary Program, which basically looks at different, looks at the mites on Guam. And quite frankly, we have not seen any of that on Guam. But comparing that to like the CNMI, well, we consider Guam, we really consider ourselves very, very lucky that we don't have the mite here on Guam. We haven't seen the mite since 2017, which is something I'll talk about a little bit more. But if you want to get into beekeeping, this is some of the advice I would give you. So you start with, start beekeeping by letting it fit your lifestyle. You start with standard equipment. Well, what is standard equipment? I'll basically talk about that a little further on. But also, you don't want to experiment on a beehive on your first year. You want to kind of know the trades first by using the necessary equipment. And so you don't want to buy the unnecessary equipment for. But I'll talk about what is the standard equipment. And of course, you know, as a farmer, right, you plant a seed and, you know, you watch it grow into a nice tree. And then all of a sudden, well, you know, you don't want to expect, you know, a certain amount of fruits during like year 5 or something. So don't, and the same thing with the colony, don't expect a surplus of honey within your first year. And of course, you want to join an association and take your time with that bee colony. It's not an overnight thing. So this is one of my advice with when it comes to starting to do beekeeping. So I am going into how to do beekeeping, but you know, if I end up going off course, please let me know. But quite frankly, beekeeping equipment that you need to use is pretty simple. Well, to some people it can get very complicated, but then like if you see my cursor here, I'm moving over what we call the hive body and with the frames. So those frames is what keeps the bees keeps their home aligned. So all those frames will hold what we call bee combs, and those combs are perfectly spaced to where when you pull the comb out, you're not ripping the comb apart. You're not ripping their home apart, essentially. Of course, you need a smoker to calm the bees down. You need a hive tool, so you can pry out the box, or you can pry out the pieces, the frames, so that you're able to pull out the frames. So bees tend to have this sticky substance is called propolis, and that propolis is what keeps kind of everything together, but it also keeps the ants out. So the bees will do this. It'll kind of create a barrier from any other pests from coming in, such as ants especially. You need a bee brush, gloves, a veil, right? So you don't want to get stung. There are other types of suits, but this is kind of the standard makeup of what you need to start if you want to start keeping bees. And then of course the hive stand and the space. I mean, if you look at the space right here, it's really low. Like you don't need that much space to. A lot of people keep bees in their backyard, in a really small confined area. And of course, you know, some beekeepers have, you know, a large space where they can put their bee colony, but really you don't need too much. However, when it comes to the stands, we beekeepers have a problem on Guam in terms of how the placement of the hive is. So we don't want it too high because it's typhoons, right? If it gets too windy, your colony can get knocked down from a typhoon. But if you make it too low, then you're going to have toads coming in and eating your bees. And so it impedes the development of that colony. So another thing to consider when you do want to start beekeeping is having a water source next to it. I always, you know, think of it, well, you know, some people have fountains in the yard, a pool, or some people may live close to rivers and a pond. But for those who don't have all that stuff, I mean, simply using like a just a just a pot, and then pour water in, and you put some the water lilies inside, and so the bees can land on it and have a nice drink of water. Some people have used the dog bowl, and they put rocks in it, and that dog bowl that has a inverted, you invert the water jug, and so that's another way beekeepers keep their bees hydrated, especially when it comes to the dry season, because the dry season tends to get pretty hot, and so the bees definitely need to collect some water. And of course, nonetheless, I know these are photos. I should have had photos of Guam per se, but I wanted to give a perspective as to the type of environment that bees would be foraging on. If I was to have a photo of all the foraging, of all the plants, not the plants, but if I was to have a photo of the jungle of Guam today, it'd be very difficult to find a nice natural state of what's native, right? And so I just decided, well, I'm looking for something that's polyfloral, so something that's where the bees can forage not just for one plant or one crop, but from different ones. And so on food, in terms of food in the tropics right now, honeybees can forage for about up to 145 different plants. That's a lot, especially in the tropics. And it's certain times of the year too. And during rainy seasons, it's this type of crop. During the dry season, it's this type of crop. And we see this with mangoes, avocados. I know avocados it's kind of a yearly thing, as opposed to more of a monthly phase. But some plants, they give off nectar all year round. So the farms, the nurseries, the rural areas often have the most variety of food, and not necessarily the urban areas. But believe it or not, some beekeepers who live in urban areas tend to get quite a bit of honey. So what is supporting those urban areas? Well, you got the roadside trees. You got some people that are gardening. Your next door neighbor could be gardening. And so quite frankly, even just living in urban areas, you can still get a good output of honey production. Hive maintenance. So when we start doing beekeeping, hive maintenance is a huge component when it comes to again, the maintenance. You don't want to just keep a bee colony and just kind of leave it out for 3 or 4 months without checking in on them. You want to check in on them at least every 5 weeks. Sometimes I leave my colony unchecked for about 2 months, but that's okay. You don't want to leave it for 4 or 5 months without checking them. And sometimes even just simply looking at your colony and just kind of looking at the activity, bees going in and out of the colony, helps. So inspecting the colony, so you want to inspect for eggs, larvae, and pupa. So if you can see down here at the bottom, you see eggs and you see larvae, and you see larvae at different stages. And so that different stages of larvae, like by looking at that, you can tell, okay, you have a queen, because who's laying all the eggs? Well, the queen is. So you have a queen, and so you're not too worried about, okay, is my colony gonna die the next time I see it? It usually takes a long period of time for that to happen. But you want to see that the bee colony has an adequate amount of food. You want to see that the space of those frames that I was talking about. You want to see that if the space of those frames are being filled up with bee combs. Otherwise, if it's not being filled up, then you don't have a development of a bee colony. And then of course you want to get rid of some of the abandoned combs. Sometimes bees will abandon a comb after 3 or 4 years of storing food. They'll over time, those combs will be abandoned by the bee. And so if those combs are abandoned, then you have to remove it. Otherwise, it's going to keep holding certain different types of funguses and pests, and that's something we don't want. So a colony maintenance is vitally important. Threats to honeybees. I'm kind of reaching the end span of my presentation here, but one thing that we are facing right now as the bee industry grows is the predator called the greater banded hornet, which I mentioned earlier. It is a huge threat to our apiculture industry. Thankfully, with several grants that we've applied for, is hoping to mitigate this this pest, not just from mitigate not just this hornet from reaching other islands, but also mitigate or not mitigate, but prevent other hornets from coming in and destroying our industry. So you notice here, you have a bunch of dead bees in the middle of this photo, and then on the photo on the right hand side, I mean, you just see all these hornets just waiting for a forager to come out so it can grab it by its head and rip it off and then throw them to the ground, exactly what you see here in the middle photo. It's pretty sad to see this, especially when your colony has produced a lot of honey for you, and then all of a sudden you have this predator coming in and just completely decimating the colony. Really sad to see this, but this is why you know, we want to take action now before it becomes even more of a problem, not just for an individual beekeeper myself, but for the 90 other beekeepers that we have on our island. And so preventing hornet attacks, we would put these grates. So as you saw earlier in one of the other videos where bees were flying in and out of through this grate, that's the same one that you see here. So so it prevents, so this grate or this mesh, it's a 1/4 inch mesh that prevents the hornets from getting in, but the bees can fit through, as you saw from the previous photo. But we're also seeing some really cool stuff happening. And this is something I want to show the audience, because when you start to look at how bees behave against other predators, you're actually seeing, you know, something that's just being discovered within the island. You know, you have this introduced pollinator, then you have this invasive predator that comes in, and you're seeing the interaction between the two. This is what keeps my drive going for the honeybee industry, is seeing this type of behavior. I mean, it's just fascinating. If you don't see this as fascinating, I don't know what will. But now if you look at, you know, on YouTube, you know, look on YouTube, hornet versus honeybee, and you will see a lot of these similar videos that's being filmed all over the world. It's like National Geographic stuff. So, and then lastly, as a beekeeper, you got to be able to catch some of the hornets, kill them, and that way you kill the messenger. If you ever run into a hornet colony, then yeah, you'll likely get stung by a hornet. But if you see a hornet hovering over another bee colony, it's you can easy target. You can catch him, you can kill him, and you prevent a mass raid with these hornets when you kill individual hornets that are hovering around a bee colony. So, and then other stuff. So yeah, I guess I can mention eradication. So I've eradicated, again, as an individual citizen, I've eradicated thousands, I would say thousands, but dozens of colonies around the island. It feels like 1,000 because you're dealing with thousands of hornets, thousands of potential hornets that could sting you. And so how do I do this? Well, it really takes a lot of strategy in terms of strategizing how to get these to kill these hornets. Well, first off, you got to do this at nighttime, because hornets, they rely on daylight to see and to catch their predators. So you do it at night. Everyone is home at nighttime, and so with everyone being home, you apply the plastic, as you can see here, apply to plastic. And again, some of these colonies are in people's homes, abandoned homes, in a couch, for heaven's sake. This is a, right here, there's a couch of hornet. A hornet's nest had nested inside of a couch of someone's home. It's crazy. And then an irrigation system right by the school. So it is a threat to public health, and also not just a threat for pollinators, but also for public health in general. Aside from all the eradication of the hornet, I want to talk about the mite, because the mite is something very tiny. We can't really see. If you're a beekeeper, if you're a beginning beekeeper, you may not even notice it. So it's very important that when we want to see this industry grow, we want to be able to make sure that this growing industry, well, we're not taking these parasites with us for this growing industry. So this mite vectors for different types of diseases. Now, it's a global pest worldwide, so it's not just Guam that had seen this. Well, again, I don't even really see this as a problem on Guam, because we found some at very low numbers, but then that was the last time we saw this was in 2017. But our neighboring island, the CNMI, has a high percentile rating. Well, why does the CNMI have this? Well, that's a whole nother discussion, a whole nother presentation in itself. But I can show you in this video taken in the CNMI how tiny this mite is. And this mite doesn't just attack the adults, but it attacks the larva, the larvae, not just the larvae, but the pupa. So that's a pupa that you see right here. And this adult mite is feeding on the pupa. And when the pupa becomes an adult bee, it comes out with either deformed wings, comes out with paralysis, it can't move, so it gets kicked out of the colony. And so over time, the colony dies off. So varroa mites, a big problem on Guam. Lastly, other threats to honeybees. I'm sure everyone has seen the Asian giant hornet arrive in Washington. It caused a lot of media to stir up, and murder hornets and all this, stuff. And it gets down to there's a lot of politics that could come into play when you're dealing with an invasive insect, because a lot of money is being put into preventing this from happening. Small hive beetle, Tropilelaps mites, we don't have any of these pests, but we want to make sure that we keep them out. That is the main goal. If we want to, again, as an industry, seeing the growth, the industry to grow, want to make sure that these pests are not present. And so the industry, when I talk about this industry, well, not just the apiculture industry kind of is an umbrella for a lot of things, not just pollination services in general, but also honey production. And last but not least, the queen bee export industry, which is something that I hope one day when I retire from my job, I hope that we are already at a point where we are exporting queen bees. Queen bees today, right now, they cost about $95. Within the US, it costs about $35 because, it's just domestic, right? But if it's coming from Guam, and if it is disease-free, and if it is mite-free, then our value of our queen bee is about 95 or even maybe even more, and probably in the future more. And because our queens are virus-free, it's disease-free, it came from a disease-free environment. So the exportation of a queen bee is very realistic here. But we just, and we have about 95 beekeepers right now on island. Now, if we see this kind of grow another exponential rate within the next 8 years, then the possibility of exporting queens is, it's in the works at the very moment. So on Guam, we haven't seen the mite since 2017. So that's about 5 years. Now it takes about 7 to 8 years, or maybe even up to 10 years to do a survey. And if we are continue to be pest-free and disease-free, then we can actually be certified by USDA to export our queen bees out to help other beekeepers around the world to maintain the pollination services and to produce honey. So again, Guam is in a really good position for this. And again, I'd hope one day to see this. So in Hawaii right now, they export queen bees to the US for about $75, of course, including shipping, but they mail out thousands of queen bees at one time. You know, these small little boxes right here that you see, and I know it's kind of blurry, but these small little boxes will have a single queen bee with about 7 to 8 nurse bees to feed the queen during transport. So you're trying to see, well, how does the queen survive? Well, she's being fed by the nurse bees. And then this queen bee will be placed into a box where it is queenless. And so over a span of 4 to 5 months, the colony grows and ends up, of course, that queen ends up is that colony. So the idea of being able to mail out queen bees, well, of course, we don't export anything. But if we were to export something, if we were to start to export something, I definitely would say export a pollinator, and you see how much value it adds in agriculture in general. So another thing I'd hope for the future, which is kind of a long shot, but is beekeeping on campus. Well, how do we do that? You know, of course, a lot of liability, but currently we have beekeeping on UOG campus, but of course it's kind of stirred away from the general crowd where they cannot get stung. But having the idea of keeping bees on campus can even help the educational system grow, not just a learning experience for insects in general, but pollination, and you touch into the aspect of farming. Honeybees can really touch on all different aspects, whether it's farming, whether it's marketing, whether it's honey production, of course, producing a product. It's kind of our new way of farming, especially now that Guam's sustainable agriculture is really to play. Honeybees have been a focal point of that. Last but not least, pollination and crop security
Dispensa, Chris, I wanted to chime in here because we've learned so much about everything that you said, and I did want to just mention we had several questions that we probably won't be able to get into today, but we would to ask at least one question before we close out.
Sure. Actually,
I know you have such a wealth of information, so I just wanted
we can kind of cut off into it because it's kind of, this is kind of the last part of it. So let's go ahead and start getting into the questions. Yeah.
Okay, I think Fran had maybe one question that we might have some time for, because we want to make sure there were so many questions that came to us and things that you mentioned, but we do want to be respectful of time, and we know that you have so much wealth of information that you know about this topic, and so we're just so grateful that you've been able to share with us. So maybe I don't know if you want to stop your screen share, you can for the time being, and then we can do just maybe one question. Fran, is that okay with you? Does that sound right?
Yes, of course. Sizos Masi, Chris, and then anyone, if you have time tonight after the GA or anytime this weekend to go night hornet hunting with Chris, just give him a call, let him know. Sorry, I'm too scared to do that, and my aim is terrible, so you will not get a call from me, but we need people who do it and love doing it and have the same passion you do. So that's actually what a lot of our questions were. People were very interested in getting involved in beekeeping, and so a couple of people were asking, how can we change the mindset to where it isn't about max goods and max profits, because they feel like that tends to hold us back. And so in the same vein, someone asked, do you need to get a business license in order to sell honey, or can we do it kind of the way that farmers do, where they can grow local produce without having to really establish a business to do that?
Well, I definitely would say it would help for two things. have a business license. And I mean, it's going to rev and tax, getting the license. I think you pay a certain fee. It's important to have that business license. Of course, you know, I think it's in order for you to sell pretty much anything, yeah, you got to be able to have one. But the second most important thing is becoming a bona fide farmer. A bona fide farmer, it does help in terms of like insurance, but mostly it helps us track, you know, like who's doing the honey farming, and then we can kind of collect some data and kind of say, well, yeah, Guam's, you know, this is how many Guam's farmers there are for honey production, and then, oh, by the way, this is how much honey that we're producing. So we can kind of be able to collect some data, and it's more so to steer to help us guide us forward to this growing industry. So yeah, for anyone who does want to start beekeeping, yeah, it helps to get a license, business license if you want to sell to other businesses. I know currently the honey bill has been introduced. That's a whole nother topic that we can talk about. But the honey bill that's been introduced is trying to so as a business, if you apply for a business license, sometimes if you're selling crops or if you're selling fish or something, or if you're selling something for retail, you're going to need like a sanitary permit. And so because honey is simply like, you know, like harvesting honey is like harvesting an apple off a tree, is just something that simple. You don't need a sanitary permit. But that's still kind of currently in the works. It's been a bill that's been introduced by Clint Rigel. So if you want to get started, or if you're thinking about selling to the retail, it helps, again, one, to get a business license, and two, to become a bona fide farmer. And the requirements of being a bona fide farmer is just as much as getting a business license. There's really not really a requirement. You gotta have, I think you gotta have land, if they want more questions like that,
land always helps.
I'll be happy to guide them to that route.
Awesome. Tsitsus Masi, thank you so much. I'm sharing my screen again briefly because I forgot to say some of our updates at the beginning. And so just as another kind of way that we can make sure that we keep these conversations going. We did have a call out earlier this year for our Kulu, our independent Guahan zine. And we just wanted to let people know that in addition to the things that you can do to follow up with Mr. Rosario about beekeeping and all the questions and different things that could come about with a possible independent future for Guahan with regard to things like sustainable agriculture and ecosystems. We can learn more in some of the creative ways that people have talked about these issues in the arts and in the zine that is going to be coming out soon. So if you're here locally, you want to follow up with us on Independent Guahan, we will have copies of the zine that are coming hot off the presses pretty soon. And I also wanted to say that as just another thank you for all of the knowledge and the information that you gave us. I feel like we learned so much. I was thinking about a lot of different puns and bee jokes, but I was also thinking about just the truth of what you shared with us, the complexities of understanding these invasive species, the native species, and then how do we help each other and support each other as we learn about the current situation for Guam here. So before we end, I know that we wanted to make sure we give one more announcement, which is that there is an event happening tomorrow for those of you who are able to come. The Power for Puerto Rico Coalition is actually hosting an event tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tomorrow Standard Time on the state of the U.S. colonies with several folks, myself included, obviously, on the panel, and we will have a chance to hear from all of the different U.S. territories. And so you can take this bee knowledge and all the information that we got from thinking about agriculture and land and local food development and connect it with lots of other spaces around the world, just like we heard from Chris. I think I was thinking quite a bit about the idea of the impact of just one species and how it's traveled all over the world, and we can bring those into conversation with lots of different things. So Tsitsus Ma'asi. I don't know if there's anything else. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. Fran, you can go ahead and bring up anything that you were gonna Okay, she's good. All right. So just wanted to make sure. Okay, we'll just stay tuned. The buzz that we generated from tonight's conversation about everything from pollinators to pollination has us thinking about what that might mean for an independent future for Guahan. And Situs Masi again for tuning in and for joining us on this this evening. And we hope that you will come back to one of our events in the future.